John came by my office yesterday and said you needed a pinch hitter here at your meeting. I told him that it's kind of an interesting story how I came about writing this book, Sesquicentennial History of Verona. Most of you, I'm sure, know that a sesquicentennial is a community's 150th anniversary. I was not here for all 150 years, but I kind of became an unofficial historian for the community of Verona. And I'll tell you how that happened and some interesting things that I learned writing the book. And then I'm going to talk more today about the process of writing the book and some of the interesting things that come about that way. And then if you have any questions that I can answer at the end, I'm happy to answer your questions. At this point, it's been 16 years. Some of the things that were rock solid in my mind 16 years ago are not rock solid in my mind anymore. So I'm going to have to refer to my own book to answer any historical questions you might have. But for starters, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I moved to Verona in 1986, which will be 27 years ago in July when I moved here. My wife got a job teaching at what at that time was the largest elementary school in the state, Verona Elementary School. We only had one. Verona had a great reputation for its school district even then. My wife was actually the Wisconsin Student Teacher of the Year for 1986. So she was a hot commodity, and they recruited her up here. And she's from Elroy, which is where Governor Thompson was from, so she's kind of a small town girl. So the thought of living in a nice small town with Madison's amenities not that far away was kind of appealing to us. So that's how we came to Verona. Depending on which way you came in, believe it or not, if you came in from the south, the sign said 3,500 people lived in Verona. If you came in from the north, the sign said 4,100 people lived in Verona. So I guess the right number was somewhere in the middle. Back then, just to tell you a little bit about how things have changed since I moved here just in 1986. When I moved here, the A&W still had car hops. They had them for about a year and a half, 2 years after I moved here. I came in and I thought, well, gosh, this is quaint. But it was really kind of cool. They didn't do roller skates at that time. They came out on foot. But they'd come right to your car, put a tray on your window. Michael's Frozen Custard arrived the year after I did. So, and as you know, my wife was teaching at the elementary school, and it was right next to the elementary school. And to hear folks talk about Michael's Frozen Custard, you would think Jesus himself had come down and started the business, because it was that big a thing. People were just like, have you tried this frozen custard stuff yet? It's just the most amazing thing you've ever heard in your life. It was just quite a shocker to have Michael's Frozen Custard come in. And that was the year after I moved here. You could not see Madison from anywhere in Verona when I moved here. Cross Country Road, the hill up at the top of going on Elma, you could not see Madison, except for the tower where Elbert Park is. You could see that. But all of the neighborhoods that are in the East Pass area, past Redden Soccer Park, was not there. There was a farm there, actually, with a tunnel underneath it. And there was a woman who's Mrs. Miglis, is that her name? Who used to, she had quite a reputation around town amongst some of our these new folks, because she'd be out there herding cows under the road every morning. And she wore the same dress and a bandana on her head, and she'd wave to you. And she was kind of a landmark of the north side of town, but that's all there was up there when I moved here. Cross Country Heights, where I live, when I moved here, was not completely built. Eastview Heights was. And in fact, the first year I was here, I went to a garage sale and bought my first set of golf clubs at Cross Country Heights, and there was construction going on every place. There was no culvers, and everything beyond culvers was not there, except for the Dane County Home. The McDonald's wasn't there. The post office was downtown. Eventually came Dave Marino's Pizza. So all that wasn't there. And like behind the cemetery, there was nothing but farming and the park. None of those houses were there. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what it was like when I came to Verona. And that was only 27 years ago. And you think about it, I lived in Verona for 11 years when I wrote this book. So. And then you think back how much has changed even since 1997. So how did I get involved in writing this book? Many of you may know I was the editor of the Verona Press for 8 years. Before I did that, I was just what they call a stringer. I wrote articles for the paper, a cub report, or whatever you want to call it. My beat was to cover the town hall. So I would go to town meetings in the town of Verona and town of Springdale. If any guys know Harlan Dahl, remember Harlan Dahl? Probably half the meetings were filled with him talking about pheasant hunting. So I sat through all those, and I covered he was a really likable guy. I covered him and the Old Town board. But I did maybe 1 or 2 stories a month for the paper. Henry Schrader was the publisher of the paper at that time. Deb Harville was my predecessor, and she was the editor. And in the fall of 1996, quite honestly, I didn't know anything that was going on with the Sesquicentennial. Henry Schrader approached me, along with Deb Harville, and asked me if I would write a history book to celebrate the Sesquicentennial, which is coming up the next year. They were going to celebrate it during Hometown Days. Not really knowing much about it, but being kind of just a history buff in general, I said, yeah, sure, I'd consider it. And besides, he was going to pay me, and I could use the extra money. And if any of you remember Henry Schrader, he didn't pay for very much, so he was the one to pay me. That was great. Now, Henry kind of looked at this as kind of a quick money maker, sort of a souvenir kind of thing. If you look, there's 2 histories written before this one. Alice Kunstman wrote one in 1947. It's a blue hardcover book. It's about 56 pages, if I recall. And there's some kind of neat old stories about Verona in there, a few old pictures. And that probably the last half, at least, of that book is a lot of family histories. There'll be a picture of an older family and just a brief description of where they lived, where the kids went, that kind of thing. Not a lot of what I would look at as historical value to it for research purposes, but a lot of good information about Verona families, that kind of thing. Ken Benke then picked up the torch in 1972 for the Sesquicentennial. And Ken's book is about this size, but it's a lot thinner. Had some of the same information in it that Alice had put into her book. I never had a chance to meet Alice. Ken was a tremendous resource when I was writing this book. And Ken's was kind of a picture book, a lot of pictures in there. The Verona Press had published that book as well. And I think Henry Schrader was thinking of becoming another souvenir-style history book, kind of like Ken's in a lot of ways, where you had a lot of pictures in there, people would buy it, kind of page through it. I had sort of different ideas. I figured if I'm going to do this, I'm going to try to write, if at all possible, the definitive history of Verona, Wisconsin, or at least put a lot of effort into it. So Henry Schrader, when I first talked to him, said, well, this project will take you maybe 3-4 weeks. What it turned into was 6 months of my life. Later, we did this book. We barely got it published in time. And it turned out, I think, really pretty well, considering the circumstances and what we had to work with. And but that's how I got involved in the project. I was just a cub reporter. Henry Schrader was looking for a souvenir for the Sesquicentennial. And I think I kind of surprised him with what I produced. He looked at it and said, almost 80 pages? What did you write about? And I had some ideas for some. If you look through it, there's some like old ads from old businesses and stuff in there. And, really came to be kind of a fun project. So when I took this project on, the question was, where do you start? Because, like I said, I only lived here 11 years. I kind of knew a little bit about the town, but not all that much. So, of course, I started with the Kunstman and Benke histories. I read those cover to cover. And like I said, there's some really good information in both of them. A couple places they contradicted each other, so you're not quite sure what's right, but not very many. And then, like I said, Ken Benke was a really great resource. Ken has just a kind of remarkable knowledge of people and addresses. He used to work for the post office, I'm sure many of you know. And so I could say, Ken, what's this building over here? And he'd go, oh, he'd go 112 West Verona Avenue or whatever. And he'd tell you, this person owned it, before that this person owned it, before that this person owned it. So he was a great resource that way. The second source I had was at our old library. I was really surprised to find they had kind of a neat little history file there. It was kind of a mismatch, and kind of like what Melissa was talking about. You had a lot of like vignettes of things in there, pictures with things scribbled on the back of them that they were organized nicely. You may have several pictures of Miller's store, for example. They're all in one folder. But beyond that, there was no rhyme or reason to them. But I was really grateful to find that someone actually had taken the time to organize the history files over at the old library. And you had to have a special key to get in there. They wouldn't just let anybody in there. And eventually they just gave me a key, and they trusted me enough to go in and go through all these pictures. Several of the pictures you see in this book are from that history file. I'm not sure how the files survived and moved to the new library, but I think they're pretty well intact.
We worked on that in the library for years. Dorothy Miller and I and a bunch of us worked on those files and with clippings from all of those over. Yes. Right.
Yeah. They had individuals' names, and they'd have just one article sometimes in there about one person. It was really pretty well done. It made my job a lot simpler going through all that old stuff. And I probably paged through every document in those. It was a good, maybe 3 file cabinets, full of stuff, about 4 drawers high if I recall. And then there was one big kind of a credenza. So I went through every file in there. Some things you used, some things you didn't. You know, sometimes I would find they would have 4 copies of the same thing, and then it would allude to something, and then they wouldn't have the thing it alluded to. You know, so but I'm incredibly thankful for the women who organized that file over at the library for helping get this project done. I could not have done that without that file. The other thing I did was I may be the only person in Verona who has read from start to finish every copy of the Verona Press from 1966 to 1997. And then I read the rest of them until about 1996, and then I moved to the chamber. I read most of them now, but I don't read every bit of it like I used to. So I've read every Verona Press for about 30 years. And I just would take note after note after note from the Verona Press. And we put that into the book. And that's why when you go through some of the book's later chapters, there's actually more information in there. Sometimes it's just one sentence about this bit, you know, kind of hit the highlights. This business opened on this day. This business moved on this day. The final resource I had was the people of Verona. Mr. Stewart was one of them. I don't remember me calling you up and talking to you when I wrote this book. I remember talking to you. Like I said, Ken Benke was a great resource. Some folks who aren't here now. Carl Miller's dad. What was Carl's name? Keith. How could I forget that? Keith Miller I talked to for a while. Folks all over town. We put something out in the Verona Press saying, hey, if you have any kind of memorabilia, any special stories you want to share, send your information to us. And we got quite a bit of stuff to send in. Sometimes it'd be something as simple as a postcard that has some information on it. Other times it would be people would just bring a big folder of stuff, and they'd put it on my desk, and dust would fly off of it. But between the resources, there's people in the community, the old Verona presses, the folks at the library, and the 2 previous histories, I was able to assemble this book. And I think we did a pretty good job. It was a lot of fun, actually. And what was really interesting about it was you'd come across one item, and then that would lead you to another item, which would lead you to another item. And next thing you know, you got a good story going here. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But what I wanted to touch on first is one of the most interesting aspects of this was working with some of the people who had to work with. Because people get really personal about their history. And and oftentimes, when I moved here in Verona, I remember in 1986, people were not shy at all about telling newcomers like me that they'd lived here all their lives, and I had just better know my place. And don't speak too loudly. And this is a lot of the crowd that I was dealing with 10 years later when I was writing this book. When people are oftentimes convinced that they are right. And sometimes their memory gets cloudy. Sometimes I would go to one person and then say, oh yeah, I was on the softball team or played recreational baseball in 1952, and I saw this guy named Al Cowie, I think it was 52, hit the longest home run in history of Rona. He was over at the old field over there, and I guess he really whacked it. And someone else would say, talk to me later about that same home run, like, no, Al Cowie played with me, and that was 1956. Well, because I can't find Mr. Cowie, who was Al Cowie? Who do you believe? You know, so you get conflicting evidence like that sometimes, and you try to go back and talk to one person, and you say, no, and you try to be gentle about it. You would kind of say, you know, I know you were sure that you were at the school and this event happened in 1949, but are you sure it wasn't 1951? And you know, sometimes they'd be, well, maybe I was wrong, and they'd think about it again, but other times they'd be really defensive. No, it was 1941. So, or whatever year it was. So you had to kind of have a little diplomatic skill when interviewing folks about some of the things that happened around Verona. Because you know, two people will tell you two entirely different things. And another interesting thing I found about working with the people of Verona was sometimes people just didn't know what they had. A good example was I went over to the town of Verona office one day, and they were like, Rose Johnson, who worked over there, she said to me, well, we have a bunch of stuff in this back closet. You can go look at it all you want, but I don't think there's anything in there you're going to want to read. So she let me in, and I pushed the dust aside. She was right about Dusty. That was one thing she was right about. But I went through all these old, fascinating files, and they weren't even aware they were there. There's a letter I quoted here about a guy who pressed charges against the town because he drove over a bridge with a hole in it and wrecked his buggy and threw him out, and he really hurt himself. And he actually sued the town of Verona. I found the letter in their old dusty files. They didn't even know they had it. Sometimes people would bring like I said, bring a file of stuff in, old pictures, and they say, well, I have these old pictures, I think you may want to look at it. And I'd pull a real gem out of there, and I'd say, hey, what is this? This is great. And I'd sometimes ask someone else, and they'd say, oh, that's the, Graven store, Graven Manning. The person who gave it to me didn't know they had it. So, floating around out there is all kinds of history that people aren't aware that they own. So that was another challenge that I had to come up with, or overcome. The final challenge with working with people was their own egos. One thing I kind of learned, and I'm not going to give any specific examples, people who are involved in history like to look good. So they would sometimes embellish their own roles in things to make themselves sound like they were in charge, they were the best baseball player, they basically ran the organization, they solved the crime, whatever it was that they happened to be talking to me about. And sometimes you double check with another source, and that source would say, well, yeah, he was part of the JCs, but he was a real pain in the neck. We hated him. So when it comes to writing the book, you've got to be really careful. You include these people who contribute to your book, but you gotta have a bent towards the truth. And sometimes, people thought their roles were a little more important than they were sometimes, from what I could gather, or at least other people would indicate that as such. And sometimes you can find people who just didn't like other people, so they would tell you things about them that weren't true or downplay the role. So there was a lot of sifting and winnowing about that kind of thing. So working with the people was a bit of an issue, but we got through it, and started writing this book. And like I said, it took me about 6 months of researching and writing time. And as I alluded to before, the coolest thing about it was you would make one little discovery. I'd walk downtown. I never really paid attention to the downtown before, as close as I did doing this book. And you get a question. And the one that always kind of comes out in my mind that I remember most distinctly was there's a building downtown, right on Main Street here, next to Bonte's. And it's got a nice facade in front of it. And then it's this kind of long thing. And there's storage and apartments back there, and some of you guys probably know what I'm talking about. And I'm looking at this building and I'm thinking to myself, who would build a ridiculous building like that? It's like this tall, and it just goes way back, and there's no real point to it. What's going on here? So, not knowing the downtown as well as I should, I asked around, and after about 2 days I asked around, someone goes, oh, that's Fischel's first bowling alley. All of a sudden, the shape of this building makes perfect sense, because the front end was the front of the bowling alley, and that's where the lanes were. There was 4 lanes in there. They had pin setters down the back, and once I found that out, I actually found someone who was a pin setter at Fischel's bowling alley. I talked to him, and he told me what it was like working back there, and talked to people who actually bowled at Fischel's bowling alley. And I talked to the Fischels for a little bit, but you were constantly going on those kinds of little, adventures in discovery. You find one little thing, you kind of go, gee, I wonder what that is, or that's kind of strange. I wonder why that looks like that. And then you'd ask around, and it would lead you to one thing, and then another thing, and then another thing. One was that public house over on the corner of Nesbitt. Ken Benke told me a lot about that.
Oh, he did?
Yeah, they used to have, I think you can still go in there, and you can still find brass coat hangers hanging coat from when it was a public house inside that barn.
The original house is gone.
Yeah. You're right, but there's, I think, stuff in the barn still where they,
Oh.
that's,
Okay.
another interesting thing I learned, I'm going to read like one paragraph of the book to you here. And it was a challenge kind of writing this, because sensitivities change over time, especially over 50 years. And one thing that kind of shocked me, well, not so much shocked me, but because I grew up kind of in the 60s and 70s, kind of when things were changing. As I read the Kunstmann history, they just were not fond of what we now call Native Americans, Indians. I just want to read for you a little section that I quoted from the Kunstmann history. It's the right page. Just to kind of show you how times and opinions and attitudes and the way you talk about things change. And this is an interview from Alice Kunstmann's history with Myrtle White, who is a descendant of the family from the White School District. I'm just going to read just a couple sentences here. And she's talking about a guy named Mulhare, who was apparently a Verona character. He had a big scruffy beard, and apparently all you could see was his eyes and his nose sticking out. Famous for just shooting Indians for no real good reason. Grandma also remembers that the 9 Mounds Prairie had 9 large mounds on it, and children in later years played there. There were also some high rocks and hills near the spring, for Grandma recalls that they could see the Indians from their house come out on the rocks and look in all directions before going to the spring for water, to be sure that Mulhare was not around. If he was around, they would go and never return. Mother said that it was a common sight when she was a little girl to go down to the spring and see 2 or 3 dead Indians lying there. When Grandma would say, well, we're safe. Mulhare's somewhere around. He had told her anytime she was afraid to be alone and needed him, to hang a rag out of the little window upstairs and he would come. Basically, he was an Indian. This kind of gives you an idea of not only how things were back, she's talking about the 1800s, not only gives you an illustration into the attitudes of how we looked at Native Americans in the 1800s, but also how we just kind of talked about them as little as 60 years ago. There's a quote, I didn't read the whole quote, but she's talking about how, later on in this little section of the book, about how Indians wanted to come and steal the women for their squaws. And just they would use language in this 1947 history that we would never use today. And that's one of the most interesting things I found. So some of the older material I had to kind of edit. Some of it I quoted directly. I mentioned in my history that you're going to find some language in here that I would not use normally. But that was the attitude I ran across when it came to Native Americans from the earlier history and beyond. It was one of the most interesting things I noticed in terms of just the way we've changed as people. another good example of that kind of attitude is, you all know how Nine Mounds Road got its name, right? Nine Mounds Road, to the west of Nine Mounds Road, there were 9 Indian mounds, and then a 10th one shaped like a mammoth. And you talk to folks who lived here at the time, and I talked to Carl Fasman one time, who owned part of that property. He told me about him and another guy wanted to see if there was any skeletons in there. He just went over and dug one up. Put it back together, didn't find anything. You know, right now we would look at that as kind of a cultural resource that we're going to want to preserve. But back just 60 years ago, it was something to be. It was a nuisance. It was kind of something to be plowed over in a lot of ways. And there's only, right now, a couple years ago for the Vernon Press, I went out one of my last years there and found the last identifiable Indian mound out there. It's right on the fence line. You have to really look to find it because it's all covered in grass. And for all I know, Epic, I guess, has done a survey and found them all, but you can't tell where they are.
Yeah, they have them up, it's all fenced off now.
Yeah.
You
But
can't really tell.
yeah, you can-
I think that the people from the university excavated all that years and years ago, probably before my time.
but there was one out there that you could still see. It's right on the fence line. I don't. It may be gone now. I have a picture of my son in the Vernon Press standing on it, next to it, so you could kind of see the elevation. That was the only one left. But you know, our attitude was such back then that this was, you know, no big deal. We plow over it. Whereas now our attitude's changed. That I went to Beloit College down in Beloit, and there's just Indian mounds all over the campus. We wouldn't think about plowing them over now. But it's just kind of an interesting way that our viewpoint has changed from the time that Alice Klinsman wrote her history in 1947, to the time I was writing in 1997. And the last little interesting item, because I don't want to talk too much longer, you know, one of the things I did was look for pictures of Verona. And one of the most talked about things at that time, it's still relatively new in 1997, was the building of the bike trail and the old railroad depot. And I looked all over for a picture of the old railroad depot. Nobody had it. Of all the things, it was torn down in 1979. I'll double check that date.
That's where Brent Sally was?
Yeah.
John Sherritt did a painting of that.
Yeah, I've seen the painting.
We do have some.
I have one now.
Yeah.
I just got one. I think I gave it to you guys. I found. I think it's Mrs. Roethlisberger found it down in the Montrose Town Hall from 1880. I guess.
I
And,
have one, or have somewhere, I don't know where in my house.
Yeah.
My husband used to hang out there when he came to Verona at the age of about 12. And he had some inside also, as well as the outside.
Oh,
Quite
yeah.
a few,
If
but I
you-
don't.
If you could ever find those and make copies and turn them over to the library's history collection, that would be a great thing to do. Because we searched and we searched and we searched. Keith Miller supposedly had all kinds of photos. He didn't have one. I found probably 20 pictures of the auditorium.
Yeah.
And if someone just turned around and shot a picture that way, we'd have pictures of the railroad depot, but we just could not find them. So if you have pictures of the railroad depot, other than this old 1880 one that I have, it'd be a really cool thing to save and make a copy of, take it to Walgreens, and get them down to the history collection at the library. Because that's a part of Verona's history that was really super important, and there's just so little photographic evidence of it. It'd be really a cool thing to preserve. So,
Maybe we should have a list of some of those things that we don't know. You know, we go through those files, and anything like a Fitchburg Star or something, we don't to it. But maybe if I knew what I was looking for.
I've been through those files at the library. Unless there's something new there, there's not one.
Okay.
Except for the one someone came, Mr. Roethlisberger found it, and she sent someone to me with pictures, and I made some for somebody to take to the library. But that's a really old, I mean, there's nothing around the railroad even on that one. So,
Or the Badger Mill.
yes, exactly.
That is a phantom. I don't.
Yep. So-
Don has the key to it.
Yep, do you? Yeah, so if
We
you
don't
have,
have any recollection of any place of what that looked like.
if you have old photos of Verona, the one thing I would ask is kind of the unofficial amateur historian for the community, is please make copies. If you need $20 to go to Walgreens, give me a call. It's just kind of something I'm a little bit passionate about. I'll get the copies made for you, and I'll donate them into the library. You know, there's just certain things in Verona that are missing. The railroad depot was one of them, which just kind of shocked me, because everybody at the time remembered the railroad depot. Nobody had a picture of it. So to wrap up the story, because it's almost 4 o'clock, and I want to, if you have any questions. As it turned out, we sold 1,200 copies of this book, which I was really proud of. Henry Schrader still owes me some money from it, believe it or not. If you know Henry, I'm not expecting to see it. That's okay, I'm doing all right without it. But I had really kind of a interesting call when I was at the Verona Press after doing this from the State Historical Society. And I'm not telling you this to brag, because my next comment will explain this comment. But the woman at the State Historical Society said, you know, can you send us a couple extra copies of your history? And I was like, sure. And she said, you know, comparatively, this is one of the best local histories we've ever seen. Now, I happen to know that a lot of local histories aren't very good, so I'm not sure if that was like a left-handed compliment or not. But just the simple fact that they would call and tell me that this was one of the better histories they'd ever read, I was really happy with to know about. And in making that comment, I would make the kind of a appeal to you folks who are interested in history, kind of like I did with the picture. When it comes to history, sometimes we as people have extremely low expectations. And I go back to Henry Schrader. He wasn't interested in history so much when he wanted to put this book together. He was interested in a scrapbook that he could sell as a souvenir and make some money off of. If we want to preserve our stories, we have to kind of rise above those low expectations. And even if you don't get everything 100% right, to the best of our abilities, preserve our history. Write the definitive history of Verona. You know, I'm not going to do the 175-year book, but I'll help the next person who comes along and wants to write it. Because if we don't do it, it's lost. And I'll give you kind of a funny example of how history gets lost a little bit here. Remember a couple years ago when Carl Miller had his 100th birthday celebration at Miller's store? I walked in to Miller's and I said, well, gee, Carl, this is great. You're having your 100th anniversary, but according to everything I've read, you're 103. And he really didn't know.
Carl really doesn't know the history. I know the history.
Exactly. But he called it his 100th anniversary.
And it wasn't.
It wasn't.
It wasn't.
Right. So, you know, these things kind of get lost if we don't kind of take it upon ourselves to raise our own expectations to preserve this stuff. And for that reason, I'd like to thank all of you guys for your interest in history in general and Verona history in particular. And just ask you, no matter what you come across, no matter how minuscule it is, if it's a doorknob from the old Dane County home, which I got to tour one time before it closed. What a fascinating place that was. But you know, by the time I was in there, they were about to tear it down, and people hadn't been in the parts I was in for 20 years in some cases. I actually found 45 records from the 1950s thrown about the floor. This stuff gets lost if people who enjoy history like you or me don't make a note to keep records, keep artifacts, tell the stories. So thank you for having me, and thank you for the work that you do. And with that, does anyone have any questions about the book? Like I said, some of my knowledge of Verona history is a little sketchier now, but I'll try to answer any questions you might have. Yeah.
Is Curtis Company too new to have been included?
Interesting story, that.
They came about in 1950.
1950.
And for about, 40, 50 years.
Yes,
they were
it's a block plant before Karl.
Right. I tried to get Karin's.
I know they wrote a book. Dick Lyons wrote up the history of Curtis.
I I've had some of my stranger experiences, both with this history book and as an editor of the Rona Press, have been with Carnes Corporation. And when I was doing the book, they were our largest employer at the time, other than the school district. And I called them up, and I said, can you talk to me about just general history of your business? And remember what it was like when the Cold War was going on, the Russians were spying on us? That's the response I got. It's like, well, we don't really like other people writing about us. We'll submit something to you, but we want final approval before even what we write goes in your book. And I was like, man, what are you worried about? So I really did get a whole bunch from Carnes because they were just so protective. And just kind of an extra story, a couple years later when I was taking a picture, there was a fellow who retired from Carnes. And he'd been playing in a bridge game, I can't remember this one, I think it was 40 years in a row. They had a bridge game going on. And he lived right over here in the corner. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. And
I think that's Richard Lyons.
I think it was Dick Lyons, yeah. So you're tired. Carnes calls me up because I'm at the Rona Press. They invite me to go shoot a picture of this bridge game. And all his family's there, and they take us on a little tour, and I have my camera. At the end, I take a picture of Richard, go back to my office, don't think anything about it, we're just going to put a little picture in the paper. I get a call from Carnes the next day. Mr. Curtis, yes, we would really like your film that you took yesterday from at Carnes. And I was like, really, why? And because we don't want any pictures of the inside of our shop going out public. And it so happened I didn't take any pictures inside. The only picture I took was outside with him and his family. And but they were insistent. They actually wanted my roll of film, and I was being good journalist. I said, "You're not getting it." I agreed not to. I didn't have anything anyway, and I told them I'm not going to publish anything inside. But kind of the gall to call me up to invite me to their event, then to demand I give them any pictures I took, including the negatives. I thought was kind of strange. That was very similar to the experience I had trying to write the history of Carnes. So there's like 2 paragraphs about Carnes.
Magnified cards, pretty much. I don't know about the beginning, but when they had the strike ones and so on, I got all that stuff.
Any other questions?
No, I just noticed the one picture in here, which was kind of neat, that Miller and Sons sold Harley Davidsons.
Yes. Yes, that's a fact that is in every history book, and there's lots of pictures of Miller's Harley Davidsons. One of the most interesting things I learned doing this was, we had the 4 grocery stores at one time. There was Kunzman's, Graven Maney, Pars, and Stewart and Miller's.
It was Government Paulson.
Yeah, Government Paulson and Graven Maney later. And how they all kind of, they all had their own little niche. And I just wondered, in this small space, how could all these stores, I wish I could have gone into them, most of them gone before my time. What kind of bustling downtown must that have been, where you have essentially 4 grocery stores in one block?
Yeah.
And I figured, they must have had to sell Harley Davidsons just to compete.
No, it's only sold Harley Davidson for 2 or 3 years.
Right.
My dad used to race them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know it was only for a short time.
them?
Yeah.
Yeah, you could get gas
They
there.
put a sidecar on it, and they go someplace, and they take the sidecar off and race, and then put
Well,
the
there's
sidecar
a
on the
picture
hole.
with his mother in
My mother's picture's
It's supposed to be in
in there.
here, with the motorcycle.
Yeah.
The trouble with history is, people don't get interested until the people are low or gone.
Yeah.
You run into that with your own family. Kids they just won't ask you questions.
On that note, Westmoreland got a grant. The Westmoreland community got a grant, and they hired a team to come in. It's May 18th for sure. I think it's May 4th. It's May 4th, Saturday. May 4th and May 18th on collecting oral history. And this team, and it's open to the public. I think it's 9 o'clock.
Did you say it's a Saturday?
It's, yeah, it's
That
on
would be the
Saturday,
19th.
May 18th at Sequoia Library. And I think it's,
Not to interrupt you, Mary, but we have an oral history done by one of your predecessors, one of Andy's predecessors, who did a video collection. It's on VHS down at the library. He interviewed a bunch of older folks, and it's kind of interesting. You can watch one tape with one interview and another tape with another interview, and they'll contradict each other from time to time, because they just remember things differently, so.
but still, it's important that, that
Yes.
we collect it,
Right.
so.
And, you know, like I mentioned, things you don't think are very historic now. Oh boy, I wish I had some of that stuff.
Yeah.
You know, people would say, "Oh, I had pictures of the old railroad station, but we just threw them out." You know, once they're gone, they're gone.
This doesn't relate to Miller's, but when we bought our first freezer, we bought it from Miller's. I got Miller's, but to use
When you talk about the stores, with Stewart and Miller, we had everything, from motorcycles to overshoes to,
Right.
we had big books with pictures of suits, and there were samples of material you could put in an order of suit. And we sold gas and oil, and two grades of kerosene, 2 kinds of vinegar, overshoe shoes, bicycle parts, anything you wanted. If you needed a prescription, we'd go down and get a prescription for you.
Exactly, yeah,
And
that's,
Drummond and Paulson's, they weren't as big in groceries, but, you know, there were other things, but they had the school books. When school would start, all the kids would have a list, they'd go down there and get all the school books, trade in your old books.
That's where I got my school books, I remember.
yeah,
going
see,
down.
that's kind of what I was alluding to. What a vibrant little one block of downtown this must have been with all
They
these
came
books.
in about 1932, they came from down Illinois. Before that, there was, up where Pars used to be, that was Blizzard's Market.
Right.
They had the original, they butchered out back, they had meat, and they had a barn out back, they had the milk route in town, they sold milk.
I think Jerry Muller had something from that butcher.
See, the trouble is, you think 1960s history, to me, that's yesterday.
Oh, I agree. One of the coolest things I did when I was editor of the Verona Press was I wrote the stories of about 35 World War II vets from Verona. I don't know if some of you remember reading those. And, you know, a good example is, you know, Dutch Becker. I've played golf with Dutch Becker now. You know, he's much older than I am, but I played golf with Dutch Becker for 20 years. And little did I know, you know, the things he did in the Pacific Island, you know, during World War II were just amazing. And you know, you don't realize that sometimes your neighbors are
He was
living
another
pieces of
story.
history.
He just finally got a pension here a little while ago, but it was the hearing.
Oh, no, okay.
Yeah, I love Dutch. Dutch was a great guy.
They used to, on the old pub, they used to have a plaque, a bronze plaque, there that had all the names of all the veterans from Roma at that time. Which, what happened to it, it disappeared, I don't know.
Somebody's got their house, so what is that?
Yeah, I'm a big Civil War fan, just in general. You know, I got to go out to Gettysburg a couple of years ago, and it's always been a kind of lifelong dream of mine, and tour the battlefield and that kind of stuff. And you realize that the Iron Brigade from Wisconsin played a major role, especially in the first couple of days of the battle there. And we had people from Verona in the Iron Brigade, you know, so.
Yeah, Ed Faber's got a bunch.
Yeah, I've read that.
Yeah.
He gave it to me to kind of look over. So, and if you have anything like Ed Faber has, you know, put it together. Find someone to help you out. Photocopy it. Send it over to the library. If nothing else, leave it in a folder and give it to somebody. So, as opposed to just throwing it away.
Where you
Because-
going for it?
Well, we're working on that.
Because I know if I could become president of the United States someday, and my kids would go, yeah, this is my dad's junk, and just throw it away.
Yeah, yeah.
So, any other questions or thoughts or comments?
Talking about old pictures, I remember back when, in the days when they used to bring people into town to get the locals together for a play, a music jam, where they would pretend they had a WLS show. They had it in the high school, which is now torn down, but that's
Right.
when that was new. And I remember that I and my neighbor girl sang in that time, and if I think long enough, maybe I can remember, Wilson Mutchell, I think, was the master of ceremonies. Anybody remember Wilson
Oh,
Mutchell?
yeah.
And there were some other ones that they were pretending to be like guys on the WLS show or the Grand Ole Opry. And I wonder if anybody, I never bought it. I had a chance to buy a picture, but I think it was 50 cents, and my folks said I didn't have 50 cents. So
There is one picture of the Verona varieties in here.
yeah, but
With Harlan Dawson,
this is not
it's
called
different.
Verona varieties, no.
There's a picture
Farmer's
of the
Day?
widow of the slave.
Yeah, right.
And of course, I remember they used to have donkey basketball in the gym of that high school.
Yeah.
And I remember, of course, one fella, he had a handful of rubber balls, and of course he was going around sweeping up the droppings from the burros or the donkeys. But anyway, he put a bunch of these rubber balls in this dustpan. He threw it up to one of his friends up in the audience. Brought the house down. But I was bowling secretary over at Campbell for many years for the Tuesday night Farmer League, or the 9 o'clock league. And I know one time we got talking about the people that used to bowl at Fischel's lanes.
Mhm.
They said, oh, they could always get good scores at Fischel's. They found out that they had kind of rounded the bottom of the pins a little bit, so they tipped easier.
When Fish built that bowling alley, that was like millions.
Right.
The bowling was a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
And in the old days, before they had automatic pin setters, they had people, young guys, practice setting pins. And some of the bowlers would throw that ball down there so hard, you know, this guy would have to sit way off to the side.
It was a very dangerous job. Yeah.
There was a guy in town here named Mac McGuigan. He lost his left arm out with a county farm in 1928, size what another Charlie when he was young. And he got real big. I mean, he was a big, strong man. He ran the filling station down in the corner, and he'd shovel snow with a scoop shovel with one hand. And one time at Fisher's Lights, Mac was drunk, and Charlie was giving him hell because he was lofting the ball. And Mac took the ball and threw it, and he took the light out halfway in the ceiling, halfway down the bowling alley. There, part Charlie, he says, "How do you like that?"
That still happens at Wildcat Lanes now, every now and again. But just in hearing you guys talk about things, I've lived here since '86, as I mentioned. I remember the old high school. My wife actually was the 5th grade when I was here, but people who lived here only a little bit less time than I have never saw it.
You're right.
So it's only in pictures. So preserve those memories whenever you can.
Well, okay.